We are delighted to have you with us this afternoon, and we are looking forward to a conversation with Kelly and Kaitlin, and also our book committee that each year does this wonderful process of choosing a top book, a top reference book, and then the top 10 books, books that have been provided to the Academy from various publishers. When we were able to have conferences, it was one of the highlights of our conference. So the Academy of Parish Clergy has been in existence for some time. It exists to help local church pastors share the practice. And we have a journal by that title that you can also access. And I'm going to turn it over now to the chair of our book team, the Reverend Bob Cornwall.
Thanks, Barbara. It is good to be together today to talk books, something that clergy, in my estimation, need to spend much time with, and with not just books about church leadership and commentaries on the Bible, though those are important, but a much broader conversation about books that speak to faith in our life together. And we're going to have one of those conversations today with one of the books that made itself way onto our top 10 list. And I'm really excited both by our guest this afternoon, who is going to be interviewed, as well as a guest interviewer, whom you will get to know in just a moment. Our team is for that reads all these books and makes these decisions. Besides myself is the Reverend Jess Skolton, who will be up next to introduce our guest interviewer and our honoree for the day, and the Reverend Ron Green. So Jess has been on this team with me for a couple of years, and this was Ron's first opportunity to be inundated with books and then have to make decisions as to which books we wanted to honor. And I'm not going to introduce the speaker, or the person being honored today. That's Jess's job, but I am excited that she is with us, as well as our guest interviewer. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jess to introduce the two of them, and then we'll go from there. And then Jess and I will bring things to a close later in the hour. But thank you for joining us.
I'm so thrilled that we're all here today. So a couple of months ago already, we interviewed Kelly Nicandea on her book, Defiant, and she's made our top 10 list a couple different times. Her book Adopted as well was part of that. And when we had Defiant and it was our book of the year, and we did the interview, we started thinking about doing potentially more of these interviews, because as Barbara and Bob reflected, our favorite thing about the Academy of Parish Clergy is being able to sort of touch base with the authors, and that faith leaders in their communities can then come together and be able to experience in a personal way some of our book of the year authors. So then one of our book of the year authors is Kaitlin Curtice, and I saw on one of the books the other one's names, and I was like, oh, they know each other. And so Kelly and I talked, and we decided, we made it into a thing. This is just a bunch of us nerding out on authors right now. So welcome to that. So we're excited to have Kelly here. She's gonna facilitate our question and answer period later, and she and Kaitlin are gonna talk. So we're excited about that. They're friends in real life, so this is great as well to have that kind of energy and connection. Kaitlin is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. She's a Christian and she's a poet, and that's all on her bio on the back of the book. And it's the function of all of this just is really brought to light in her writing. And so the book is Native Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. And she speaks and writes on faith and justice within the church as it relates to Indigenous people. So we're excited to have her as a guest. Welcome, Kaitlin. Why don't you open up and tell us a little bit about the book itself and the process that it came to be born in you and then written and shared with us.
Yeah, okay. So thank you everyone for having me. I think I'm gonna step back a little bit to, why I am a writer and why I started writing, because that it all feeds into my first book, into this book, into who I am. So I'm a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, and I grew up as I write about in the book, in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and around age 9, I moved to Missouri, and that's where I spent a lot of the rest of my adolescence. And now I'm living in Philadelphia with my family, and so I've kind of been all over the place and have been able to write from all these beautiful parts of the country, and I'm really grateful for that. When I was in high school, I took my first psychology class, and I loved it. I fell in love with it because I have always loved people, and I've always loved trying to understand the way that people work. How do we think? How do we feel and believe? And why do we believe? And what do we believe? And how do we just care about each other? And so I fell in love with psychology. And then I went into college and decided to study psychology for a while. Stuck with that, was always taking literature classes just for fun. I never planned to be a lit major, but I was always taking a poetry class or a literature class, just anything to read and to write. And then I switched to social work. So it was just kind of another, path to learning about people. And so throughout college, I keep taking, I'm in my social work program, that's my major, but I keep taking all these lit classes, and I should have known then that I couldn't make a decision. And and so now it's like I've just kind of combined all of that into who I am, that I write on people, and I write about what it means to be human, and I write about the human experience and these issues of social justice and these issues of how we care for ourselves and care for one another. And I'm doing that through words, and I'm doing that through poetry. I've always been a poet. I've been writing poems since I was little. And so that's always just been a part of me. So I think now I've kind of I realized after Native came out that this is kind of the full circle of what I tried to do when I was younger, but didn't know how it would work. It's like now I understand how it all came together, and inside me, how I've embodied that in my work. I think that the best way to sort of explain how Native came to be is to describe sort of where I was when I wrote my first book. So I started blogging when my first son was born in 2011. So I started a blog, and it was called Stories. So it was basically a blog of storytelling, of telling about the human experience. And I was, so I was a young mom, and I wanted to write about the things I was learning in my spirituality, the things I was learning about being a mother, about being a friend, about being a woman. I just wanted to have a place to process and to explore that wasn't just a journal. So I started a blog. Those were popular at that time. And then, a little while later in 2016, I was like, maybe I could write a book one day, but I don't know how to do that. And I happened to have all these sort of essays and prayers I had written, and they ended up getting published in my first book called Glory Happening with Paraclete Press. And so it was just this beautiful experience. And it just made me realize, like, oh, maybe I can do this. And at that time, where I was in my faith was sort of at the beginning of my deconstruction journey. I had grown up in the Baptist faith. I had grown up very, legalistic, even just to myself, kind of shamed myself into believing, didn't ask a lot of questions. I went through the purity movement. I was tried to just be so good all the time, and didn't allow myself to ask questions and to doubt as much as I wish I could have. And so I think as, becoming a mother and then asking these questions of my entire identity started to open up these bigger questions, right? And so that sort of began my deconstruction journey. I started learning about the desert fathers and the desert mothers. I started reading Richard Rohr, and I discovered Barbara Brown Taylor, and, these people I'd never heard of, growing up Baptist. And that really kind of just blew open my world and allowed me to see another part of Christianity I didn't know was there. And so it gave me a chance to find more expansive language and more expansive ways of believing in mystery. That really helped me. And so that kind of laid the groundwork for me. And so as Glory Happening was coming out, also inspecting and coming to parts of my identity as a Potawatomi woman, as a mother, as a Potawatomi mother, and trying to understand what assimilation is and trying to understand who I've always been. Have I hidden parts of myself? All these hard questions that just came bubbling up because I was already deconstructing my faith. Those things just kind of came along with it. And what that led me to was then questions of decolonization, which I write about in Native. Decolonization for me is literally just asking these questions of how have I participated or how have I been a victim of colonization in my life? How have I participated in systems of colonization, and how can I stop doing that? How can I pay attention to the ways I've been complicit in that in my Christian faith? And so that led me to write Native, to struggle with this really hard space of asking myself, asking the church to own its complicity in colonization, and then trying to understand who I am as a, white-coated Potawatomi woman, as someone who has privilege, as someone who is Indigenous and struggles with my indigeneity, and how to place myself in the world and in these spaces, and how to be a better advocate for everyone around me. And so questions of solidarity work, and questions of activism, and questions of humanity, and questions of doubt, and asking questions, and that all came out. And so that was kind of, it felt different. It felt different writing Native, because it was like the next, sometimes they say it was like the next rung of the ladder that I needed to climb, or maybe it was the next circle. If I'm starting in and I'm working out, it was that next layer of the onion, maybe. It was that next part of the journey for me. And so that's where I am now. And what I have recognized since my book Native came out is that one thing is I love writing poems. And so you'll find poems throughout the book alongside the essays. And I kind of put those in there just as like a breath, like just to help us like pause for a second. And then I realized that I love, the way that we tell stories is so important. So I love to frame my books around a larger narrative, around a large story, and then kind of weave my life and my own stories into that narrative or into that idea. And so that's why I did the Potawatomi flood story, which we can talk about more later. So my book is filled with a lot of questions, and it's funny, since it came out, a few people have brought that up, that I ask people a lot of questions, but I don't give them answers. And that's not the point of my book. My point is not to give answers. I don't love giving answers, because I think that I can give ideas and I can give experiences, but I don't like saying that this is the answer to the problem, because I think that we have to figure that out together, or we have to figure it out in our own spaces that we inhabit, and so what I love to do is help people ask the questions first, because in my experience growing up, a lot of the time I just didn't ask the question. And if I could have asked the question, how could my experience have been different? Or how could my idea of who God is or who mystery is been expanded? How could I have brought other people into my experiences if I had asked more questions? And so that's what I want to do. So I'd love to do a little reading from Native. And this is from a chapter called A Heart Language. And it's about me sort of coming to the Potawatomi language as an adult and how much it has meant to me. So I'm just going to read this little half of one of the essays. I did not grow up learning to speak Potawatomi or knowing that the language itself even existed. The only language I learned growing up was English, except for the Spanish I studied in high school or the Russian I studied in college. I had no idea that we as Potawatomi people had our own language, a language that connects us back to our identity, that allows us to know our stories and our unique way of experiencing the world. I listened to the Potawatomi language for the first time over my laptop speakers while I made dinner one afternoon a few years ago. I heard the speaker from Citizen Potawatomi Nation tell me words I had never memorized, hardly heard, that still speak to me in ways that move every fiber of my being. I stood there with tears in my eyes because the things I did not yet understand were the things I seemed so desperately to need. To speak the language spoken by my ancestors years ago, before we were forced out of our home, before we were assimilated into a white culture that wanted only English spoken. The first thing I memorized was a Potawatomi prayer, one that I often use instead of praying in English. It gives me a different space with Creator, Mamogosnan, Great Mystery, K'che Manado, than I've ever had before, a space I cannot reach in any white American church. Potawatomi author Robin Wall Kimmerer says, "Our language sounds like wind in the pines and water over rocks. Sounds our ears may have been more delicately attuned to in the past, but no longer. To learn again, you really have to listen." Our language teaches us to tune our souls back to the land, to Sigamakwe, who has always held us. Our language reminds us that we come from dust and we will return to that dust, our souls floating and resting in the magic of the galaxies and the cosmos. I began an online course to learn the Potawatomi language, to have something to pass down to my children and to their children after them. I sat at my white desk by the window in my bedroom while my 3-year-old napped on the bed, and I took notes and quizzes and breathed in and out the old and sacred words. Language is wrapped up around everything else in a culture, no matter what you speak or where you're from. It's sacred, connected to identity, to ethnicity, to soul, to mystery. It is the way we move, the way our hearts speak, the lens through which we see the world. Without language, we are lost. I know that this language learning will be our legacy, the thin line that carries us generations down the road. It will take time. And it constantly feels like I'm taking 10 steps back and 1 step forward. But every step forward is grounding me in who I am and have always been. As a child, without knowing my Potawatomi language, I may have missed understandings of God other than what I received within the traditional Southern Baptist churches I was part of. Knowing, for example, why we go to powwows, the significance of ceremony, dancing as prayer, the important rhythm of the drums, the connectedness of community, that might have given me a different idea of how we build community in a lasting and sustainable way. I might have understood why the trees have so much to teach us and why water should be protected. That is why it matters so much that many Native people are returning, despite the work of the church and the American government to break those ties. The day I learned that the word America meant what I learned, the day I learned what the word America meant in Potawatomi, I was reminded again of what we've lost and the importance of returning again to our own words. Potawatomi is not English. Our Potawatomi words have so much meaning behind them. The word for America, K'che Mokmankik, translates loosely to white person with long knives, referring to the Europeans who invaded our lands and butchered our people. This is why language matters. It helps us understand where we come from and what it means to be Indigenous. Our language carries our stories and experiences, and for as long as whiteness has tried to steal that, we have continued to be who we have always been, and we will pass that on to our children.
Excellent. That was beautiful. Yeah, I'm going to hand it over. You're up, Kelly.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, we were having a moment to pause. Kaitlin, I always love hearing you read your work, whether it's a poem or your actual essays. I love it. So thank you for starting us off in your own words. And I love hearing you vocalize the Potawatomi words, because when I see them on the page, I mean, I can't even imagine the sounds. And it is true what Robin says. When I hear you use Potawatomi words, even in the context of our friendship and conversations, it does sound like wind and water on rocks. I mean, it's beautiful. So I'm glad that you kind of gifted everybody that opportunity to hear some of those words in a context that allows us to imagine what they mean. I am particularly, as you know, I have always been so connected to the idea of the creation stories. So I first heard the Potawatomi flood narrative through Robin Wall Kimmerer, her book Braiding Sweetgrass. And when you told me that you were thinking of using that as a frame for Native, I mean, I couldn't get my hands on your book fast enough to see how you were going to break that open.
Yeah.
And you already shared that you use that as kind of the macro, the larger frame that you wove into. But I'd love to hear even, yeah, I just love to hear you talk a little bit about how that narrative has informed, informed you as a mom, as a woman in, what I would say are troubled and traumatized times. How has that narrative just energized you?
Yeah, so I, didn't grow up hearing this story. I grew up with the narratives I read in the Old Testament and the Bible and the New, like I grew up with those, our Hebrew creation stories that Christianity uses. And so I grew up with that. I grew up with Adam and Eve. I didn't grow up with any of these stories. And I also grew up, as a literalist. And so in a literalist, world in the Baptist, like I just imagined that must have been how it happened. I didn't think of these stories as this beautiful literature that could help us understand the world, if that makes sense. I wasn't asking those kinds of questions. So as an adult, I remember I was in a Sunday school class and we were talking about flood stories and how all over the world there are flood stories because cultures experience floods, and then you have to figure out what's happening. That's how we make sense of the world. That's how we make sense of God or creator, what's happening. And we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I had never heard of, still don't know a lot about, but I know enough that it was this other story. And I was like, well, if that's a story, there must be tons of stories. And then it just kind of, blew my mind open. And then I'm like, of course, they're indigenous to all over the world. The indigenous peoples of those places are going to have their own creation narratives, their own flood stories, their own stories of how things began. And so I eventually found my way to our, Anishinaabe or Potawatomi flood stories. And it was just so beautiful to hear about how, it's this same idea of creator floods the earth. Things are bad. Things are really bad. And everything is flooded. And then there's this moment with original man who I've told people, if you want to think of that sort of as your Adam, if that helps people to frame that, then you can, but there is no Eve. There's original man and the animals. They're his companions, and they're all sitting together on this log, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And in my mind, the total beauty and irony of all of this is that my book came out during COVID, and this flood story is literally, I'm beginning this story with them sitting on this log thinking, when are we going to have land again? And then this idea of when are we going to begin again? When are we going to get to the other side of this? And that really hit me as the book was coming out. Like, I am releasing this into a world that's asking the same question, that we're in this flood, right? And that was really powerful for me. And I couldn't have planned that, I couldn't have made that happen. And so it really released that for a lot of people, was the importance of these flood stories isn't just to tell them as something that happened a long time ago, but these stories are meant to teach us now. And so I hold that story so dear even now, because it's helping us ask right now, everything's gone or everything's different than it was. People have died. We've lost things. What could possibly be on the other side of this? What could possibly be made better again?
Right.
And I think that this beautiful story, and then you have Muskrat who dives into the water and gets the dirt and he dies. He sacrifices his life for us. And the turtle, gives the turtles back for the land. And so we have land again. And all of it is just this beautiful sense of community and of solidarity and of caring for one another. And that's what we should take with us into whatever world we're creating now, whatever future we're creating in. So I couldn't have imagined how that story could have been more important during this time. And it makes me even more honored to get to carry it and to speak it and to share it with the world,
Mhm. I think when I read Robin's and then I read your because there's a few different, right?
Yeah.
There's not just one version. There's different storytellers have written the flood story, and there's Sky Woman, and right. And it never had occurred. It broke something open in me.
Yeah.
Like you said, questions that I had never asked, because my creation narratives that I grew up with, the two in Genesis, didn't bring me to some of the same questions that the Potawatomi flood narrative did.
Right.
And it was like opening up this box of different potential, different questions, and different, like the solidarity with nature, the way that the animals were partnered with the original man. And I remember reading those stories and hearing you talk about them and weeping, because it opened up a completely different way to receive goodness. And I think I had grown up in evangelical spaces where the only goodness was from the Bible. You weren't allowed to have good, holy, sacred stories that cracked you open from any other tradition.
Right.
And I would say, really, hearing you talk about the Potawatomi creation narrative was one of the first experiences I had with opening myself up and allowing that another tradition can bring spirited goodness.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so it was a gift. It continues to be a gift to me. And I'm so glad that that was the frame you used.
Yeah.
I do want to just bear in mind, we are having a conversation with our friends at the Academy of Parish Clergy, and that they are serving in particular small and mid-sized parishes. The people who are in our parishes around across the country, day in and day out. And it makes me so excited that they have Native in their hands, that this is a gift and a tool that you have offered. But I would love to hear you talk about how you would imagine Native could be. I hate to use the word use because that sounds so transactional, but you know what I mean. How can Native be a gift that pastors can crack open for themselves, but also in the life of their congregation? I mean, I have a few ideas, but I would love to hear
I'd love to hear yours too. Well, I think that to me, the most obvious thing is book groups. I have a discussion guide on my website. I think that on Baker's website, they have the discussion guide there as well. I created that for people to have discussions. And, I'm talking about a lot of really hard things in this book that I would really like for the church to address, even before the church gets to conversations about action, that they would just read and sit with what I'm saying and what other Indigenous folks are saying. Sit with these ideas of whiteness and assimilation and the doctrine of discovery and boarding schools and the legacy of America and what it is to us as Indigenous folks. And so I would hope that there would be time and energy put into that. And I think that, the other thing that happens to me, which I write about in Native every year, right around Thanksgiving, I start getting all these messages. How should I talk to my teachers about Thanksgiving? Can you tell me, all these things, just asking for things from me that I can't give. Or from wonderful teachers who just don't know how to teach these things, or Sunday school teachers who don't know how to teach these things. And I think that another point I would just make is begin thinking about this stuff in January. Begin thinking about us before Thanksgiving rolls around. Don't wait until you're reminded of us because of these stories that you should do something, because usually that produces more harm than good. If we're actually settling into what is this solidarity work and how do we actually pay attention now? How do we read these books and really wrestle with these hard truths? That will produce a different kind of action than a panicked response right before Thanksgiving. You know what I mean? And so be ready to be dedicated to the work for the long haul all the time. I think that that's something, and you'll hear that from all different sorts of groups who are fighting to be heard and to be seen, is that sort of the sort of panic reactions of wanting to do something usually don't produce what we need. we need the like sustained work of trying to get this this change brought about, you know. And then of course there's a book that I am just telling everyone to read besides mine. Sarah Augustine has a new book called The Land Is Not Empty, following Jesus and dismantling the doctrine of discovery. And it's Herald Press. And so Sarah Augustine, The Land Is Not Empty. And it just came out this summer. That is a book, you know, Sarah writes like an academic. She's an academic, a thinker, like the way that she tells the story of America. We're talking about boarding schools, which we need to be talking about right now in churches and in our government, because in Canada, things are happening with residential schools, and that's a part of our history too. And the church is a part of that history. And so, you know, reading these books, reading my book with a discussion guide, reading Sarah's, you know, you could read both of our books 2 different months and talk about them. You know, there's so many resources there. It's just daunting, I think, to know where to get started. And I think to keep that in mind of doing it for the long haul and really letting it become like part of your church's embodiment is to make us part of that, not as in like to create relationship with Indigenous people necessarily, but to begin to tell the truth and to reframe your church's way of understanding history and understanding who Indigenous people are, because that's where then when we need time for action, you will be prepped in a different way. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, and that's what I mean, as a friend, I would hear you have to respond to this.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, around Thanksgiving always.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever things come up in the news, whether it was Elizabeth Warren and her candidacy and some of the questions about her identity, or what's happening with missing women in Canada and Indigenous, the things we're learning about Indigenous education, what's happened, you know, the mass graves. I mean, it's all of a sudden everybody wants to run and get an article from you or a word from you, a hot take from you. And my thought was, how does your book become a way that we can do the deep work so that we're not, in a sense, traumatizing you and other Indigenous people every time something happens? Because we're eager. I think sometimes our conscience is provoked. We want to learn when we want to. I would assume as pastors, part of what we want to do is help our congregations also be on that journey. But how do we do it in a way that isn't traumatizing very folks who are already having to grapple with it? And so, I mean, I was going to say, I wish people would start reading Native, you know, ahead of the holiday, so that pastors and leaders in the church, you know, are already changing their language, are already changing their sense of the history, that process can happen slow and unhurried, but that there'll be a readiness so that even as pastors are preaching and as leaders in the church are having conversations with one another, even their language starting to shift.
Right.
I mean, my background is rhetoric. And so we always talk about how important word choice is, that as the language of the leader starts to shift and the congregation starts to shift, that starts to open up true transformation in how we, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, that was the thing. I was like, man, I want people to be reading this way before Thanksgiving.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is people want to jump to asking me like, well, what does reconciliation look like? And I wrote a recent piece about how the church in America needs to be ready for sort of a reckoning, because we are going to start uncovering things about boarding schools, and we are going to find things that are going to be really difficult for Indigenous people to bear. And at that time, the last thing I want is for someone to ask how we can reconcile it. I need us to like tell the truth first. we need to be telling the truth before we just fix something, right? Like that's not the way it works. If you have harmed someone or been part of the harm of someone, you have to work on that relationship. It doesn't get to just be fixed. And that's what it makes me think of as I get asked that question of what does reconciliation look like? And I'm not interested in that conversation right now. One day I might be, but I think that we need to start having other conversations first and sit with that reality before we can get to those things. And I think that's another reason to read my book and to read Sarah's book, is to sit with the stories for a while before we start jumping to the next, action plan.
Well, truth telling, but then, I mean, Jessica and I've had this conversation, you and I've had this conversation, that it also invites lament. When we tell the truth,
Yes.
we create space to really grieve.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
that's right. That's a healthy part. And that lamenting, that expression of grief has to happen before we get to the hope and the change.
Right.
So I think you're right. I am curious. I know a lot of pastors do things, they either have Sunday school or there's children's moments
Mhm.
as part of Sunday worship. And I'm curious if you have any children's books that you love to read to your boys, things that could, either in Sunday school or as part of a church service from an Indigenous perspective, that some of our pastors could consider adding to their collection.
Yeah. Hold on, I'm looking them up right now because um so one book that I love is called We Are Water Protectors, and it's by Carol Lindstrom. And this book has been a New York Times bestseller. It's
Okay.
beautiful. And what I know from working in a church as a worship leader is that we love themes, and we need those things to keep us going. And the beautiful thing about, so many books by like children's books by Indigenous authors is that you can easily sort of fit a theme around it. Like you can easily say, it's Earth Day. We're going to read this book, We Are Water Protectors, and we're going to talk about how we are called to care for the land. We are called to care for the water. And that Indigenous people have been doing this for a long time. Like you can do this. And so I would recommend Dr. Debbie Reese has a website called American Indian Children's Literature. American Indian Children. Here, I'm actually going to just put it right into the chat for you guys.
Perfect.
Let me just do that. That'll be easier. This resource has everything. It has tons of books. Of course, it also has those books that have been written throughout history that we thought were really great, written by non-native authors to honor us, that have actually done more harm than good, which is a really bold and important thing that we also need, because we all read those books that were like, people who wanted to celebrate or try to honor Indigenous people, but actually reinforced some stereotypes about us. Books written in like the 1950s that we're still using today. When instead there are all of these amazing books. You could read Birch Bark House by Erdrich and you could do a book study with kids, do a book study with your middle school age. There's another one, oh gosh, Ancestor Approved, which is a book of essays, and they're hard. They're going to be hard to read. And the other thing I would say, because I get asked this, is, tell me who the other Native theologians are that you read. And I'll say to people, please don't just read from Indigenous people who say they're Christian. Read from all Indigenous people, because sure, my lens is giving you something, but read from my Indigenous, friends who are not Christian, who have had a really hard time with the church. Read from all of that, because you need to understand our perspectives across the board. You need to understand the ways we've been harmed, and the hopes and dreams we have for our people. They're so varied, and I hope that people aren't just reading my one book and saying that they're good. I want them to read tons of books from all sorts of Indigenous people to get a fuller picture of who we are and how they can be better allies. And that's my hope, is bring those into your churches. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, bring all the books, read them all.
All the good books.
All the books.
I know. I'm getting rid of My Little House on the Prairie, and my daughter read the Birch House books instead.
Yeah.
Now, not unrelated to books, but I want to bring all the artists. And you have introduced me to an artist that I just love her work. So can you share with us about the cover art and a little bit about like how that came to be and the amazing artist who did that for you?
Yes, I'm going to show this is the cover. So when I talked to you about the creation story, or sorry, the flood story. So here's muskrat, and here's turtle, and then this is a, I think it's a sage. Is this our sage? And then it's coming up out of the, out of the roots, and this is so this is my cover, and then this is, it's gonna be hard to see. This is a tattoo I got a few years ago, and it's the same artist. So you can see, sorry, they're upside down, but you can see that sun and some of those similarities. So some of the flowers, the floral. Chief Ladybird is the person who designed this, and I got this tattoo of hers a few years back. She had posted on Instagram, and it was just this beautiful, like, oh, there it is. It's this beautiful, it was just this beautiful picture of the 7 generations kind of climbing toward our ancestors. And so just our story as a people, without going into all of it, climbing toward our ancestors, and our ancestors is that light. And it was just so beautiful. We had never met, and I messaged her and I asked if I could have permission to get that as a tattoo, and she said yes. And so this was my first ever tattoo, and it just meant so much to me. And so when I knew I was writing this book, I was like, I know who I want to do the cover, so you all need to just, get that done. And Brazos was amazing, and they got it done. And so she did the cover, and it's just everything I could have asked for. She's an incredible artist, and I just love every time I get to partner with her or celebrate her work, or she's celebrating my book. And it's just meant so much to me. So, inside the book, you have her designs, they incorporated it in, and they just, I'm just so pleased with, it's just so unique, and it's so important to have our stories be representative of who we are in every way, including the artwork. You have artists who really struggle with cover design, and especially if they're from a minority group or they're trying to figure out how to do that. And you have, some publishers just have a harder time with getting, like BIPOC artists. And that was really important to me. And I'm so grateful that Brazos honored that and worked with me just without question to get this cover art. And I love it so much. I remember
the day that Kaitlin sent over the artwork and we celebrated together. That was very fun. I'm so excited. Yeah. Now, real quick, because I know we're closing in on our time, but in terms of art, you are also really excited about Rutherford Falls.
Yes, I am. They just
very quickly, because this is another way that you have been facilitating conversation and community on Twitter.
Yes.
And I just love it.
Oh my gosh. Okay, they just announced today there's a season 2 coming.
So this is a TV show. So this is something that's very accessible.
It's on Peacock TV, and so that's kind of the NBC app. I think that's how that works. But it's on Peacock TV, and it's it's a show about a place called Rutherford Falls, and it's this town that is trying to come to terms with its history. And so it's got this sort of colonial settler history and this indigenous history, and then 2 best friends that represent each one. These best friends who are trying to honor their people's stories, and they love each other, but they're also just deeply human. And so there's all these layers. And the most beautiful thing is that the writing team is indigenous, and you have actors and actresses who are indigenous, and the ways that they've told the story. I've never seen a show like this where I have been able to laugh at, an elder like slapping a guy in the face because he says something about the language, and it's just like, you're just staring at the screen like, I've never seen this on TV, because we have never been represented in the way that our comedy is, or our laughter. And it's not one of those shows that just points at our constant oppression. It's not one of those shows that's like, here's the sad Indian and then they're gone in an episode. It's a show that's like about our beauty and about our art. They're wearing our beaded earrings, and it's just a total celebration of who we are. And now it has a season 2. And on Twitter, I interviewed some of the stars of the show, and I interviewed the the head like writer of the show. I interviewed her. And so it was just, it was so meaningful for me. And it was just another step for me, and just celebrating who we are. We should be celebrated, and not always just like look at the bad stuff happening to these people again, you know?
And I would say that that is one of the things I hope as pastors and congregants get Native in their hands and in their churches, is that this only begins the conversation of not just what is Native history, or what is the work we have to do, because we have work to do to dismantle some of that in our own story, name it and dismantle it, and to reckon with history, because we do have all that. But one of the beautiful things in friendship is recognizing the beauty and the joy and the wisdom and like you said, the joy of seeing us represented well and being able to laugh and to savor that. And like I would love to see people be able to reckon with the hard things, but also enter into all the beautiful things in culture and art and all of that too, because that is also part of, as I experienced it with you, part of what it is to have reclaiming your Native identity. Is you're reclaiming all of the goodness, not just all of the pain and the trauma, which has to be dealt with, but all of the goodness and the gifts. And I hope that congregations will be able to just begin the journey of seeing what is just so good and beautiful. Because I think that is absolutely what we've missed. And I know more times than I can count where your book and your words and your stories have been a balm to me. Not a bomb, a balm, a salve to me. And so I really would hope that for others,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I say about even things like Thanksgiving is, don't just tell the truth, the hard stuff, but then find ways to celebrate. Make a dish that's made from indigenous foods, make a wild rice dish and buy the wild rice from Honor the Earth that, they're growing.
The Three Sisters squashes.
Yeah, like find ways to celebrate, like that's how we can begin to keep healing, because it's not just about telling the harsh truth, it's about the celebration as well. Watch Rutherford Falls, please.
Now, we have a little bit, not much time, right? Just very little. I will say now, I guess you would say that I'm white coated Latina. Is that how the best way we would describe? So my birth mother is Latin, but I was adopted into a white evangelical family and pretty much raised white. And it's interesting. I had never ever embraced the word assimilation with my own story ever. Mm-hmm. I knew what it meant. I had studied it, but never ever did it cross paths with my own self-understanding until you were writing the book. And as you were talking about that process, I was like, I've been assimilated. I've lost part of my Latina culture. Mm-hmm. And that part of the process for me of reclaiming my own identity has been really helped by you giving me languages and concepts that I had never picked up before as helpful tools. And so I think I would want to also encourage people that your book, while you are helping us understand Native experience and what it is to be human from your vantage point as a Potawatomi woman and mother, I think also for a lot of us, you will be surprised at how the tools that Kaitlin uses to tell her own story are going to be helpful in your own exploring your own story, because it was for me. So it's not just honoring somebody else's story, but I think your work gifts us with tools for our own journey of belonging and identity and discovering God. And I'm just so grateful for the work you've done and the way that it's impacted me. And I trust that the Spirit's at work, and it's going to be a blessing to the church, across Turtle Island and beyond.
Thank you.
So, Jessica.
Excellent. Thank you so much for letting us just take a peek into your conversation as friends as well. So we just want to wrap up. The biggest part of The book of the year is handing off good books to pastors and priests and all sorts of folks in the interfaith community who are faith leaders. And so, as you can tell, Caitlin's a Christian. And so that has that perspective. But what I appreciated most, and what I think faith leaders, when I think about the ways that they can use the book, I think of that story, Kaitlin, that you tell about the monk that you ran into, Brother Mark. And you're as you tell the story, you say it wasn't just like about who has the best ideas about God or faith. It was about two human beings seeing each other. And that's what I appreciated with the book, that I think will really help congregations and our faith communities, is to be able to have that experience. Like you said, both the concerns, the truth telling that needs to happen, but also the ways that we can celebrate and understand better. So I would say that would be, for me, a reason to just get this in the hands of our faith leaders and have that shared with their congregation, certainly as a book club, certainly in homilies and preaching and things like that. I also thought I really appreciated the aspect of setting the table for everyone. And and I think that's a universal faith practice that we're all seeking to embrace. So thank you very much. Bob, what's your top reason for passing it on to the Academy and faith leaders? Oh, here.
There we go. Well, first of all, I wanted to just thank Kaitlin for joining us, and for Kelly for facilitating the conversation. One of the things that I liked about Caitlin's book, but it relates also to what Kelly does, is both of them are tremendous storytellers, and I'm not much of a storyteller in the same way. And so I appreciated greatly how, Kaitlin, you wove your own story with the larger story, which I think is really helpful. And in this time and space where, we're talking a lot about critical race theory and American history and all of that, what you do is make it personal. It's not just facts and figures. It's a life story, and so I think it will be really helpful for clergy to have this to share. And I like the idea that maybe book groups that could use this to have that conversation. It's just an excellent book. And when I first read it, I'll say the first I heard about you because of the flap at Baylor. So I heard about this person who had this horrible experience speaking to a group of students at Baylor University. And then I said, well, I better go find this book. And I was able to get a review copy of the book. So that's kind of my own story in terms of connecting with that. So it's just a powerful book. There's so much about it. And that this is like, what I'm about 30 years your senior. So, and written a number of books, but so I'm amazed at at your age, the capacity to write in this way. It is just amazing. So I am thankful for the book and for what you're doing. And I learned about a sitcom to watch, and another book to I have to contact a different publisher to get a review copy of. Just added to my life. So thank you so much for participating in this conversation, and Kelly for engaging the conversation. Sure. It really was a blessing. So thank you very much.
Awesome. All right, y'all, go read.
Yes. Oh, Matt,